Cold War anxieties seemed at odds with rising domestic prosperity in the aftermath of World War II, as programs like the GI Bill and Truman's Fair Deal created avenues to middle-class status for many Americans. The Cold War fostered unprecedented economic growth in global capitalism. Military spending on new technologies led to advances in domestic production and consumer goods. These twin engines of economic growth created an extended period of domestic prosperity and more widely spread affluence than at any other time in American history.
Each returning serviceman will get his job back when this war is won. And you women and girls will go home, back to being housewives and mothers again, as you promised to do when you came to work for us. If all industries would adopt this simple policy of taking care of their own employees, there would be no serious post-war problem of unemployed.
For some of the generation who came of age during the 16 years of global economic depression and war, there finally seemed reason to hope for a brighter future. Those Americans who supported the agenda of the New Deal saw the post-war boom as an opportunity to expand the scope and reach of social welfare programs. For soldiers who benefited from education and preferential hiring policies, part and parcel of the GI Bill and Fair Deal, these advantages often came at the expense of their wives, sisters, and mothers. In the years following the war, women were expected to move from their wartime identity as heroic Rosie the Riveters back to traditional roles as wives at home. Lower income and minority women were forced back to the lower paying, limiting jobs they had held before the war. Many women resisted this trend, but employers, with support from the government, required most to leave lucrative jobs and abandon hard-earned skills. During the war, the percentage of married women and mothers entering the workforce had increased from 13.9% to 22.5% and 7.8% to 12.1% respectively. Wartime polls showed that between 60% and 80% of these women wanted to keep their jobs when the war ended. But when the war actually ended, women workers faced pressure from a new wave of government propaganda, encouraging them to hand their jobs back to men. The systemic removal of women from the industrial workforce was more than a practical response to the return of male vets. It became a Cold War imperative. Government Cold War propaganda stressed that American women could best fight the communist ideological menace by being homemakers. Comparisons between women's work in the Soviet Union and women's work in the U.S. became important points of differentiation for the two systems. The Soviets celebrated women workers as symbols of socialist equality. American politicians pointed to Soviet women workers as an example of the backward communist system that required all to slave away in service of the state. Images of well-dressed American housewives, surrounded by new appliances, became standard U.S. propaganda tools. Globally, the U.S. and USSR fought for the hearts and minds of developing world women through competing organizations. The UN-supported International Council for Women advocated for democracy and freedom for women and children. The Soviet-backed Women's International Democratic Federation supported nationalism and colonial independence in the fight against fascism and racial discrimination around the globe. In the international arena, the WIDF's pro-nationalist message had great appeal, while the ICW could point to the rising standard of living for women in America and U.S.-occupied Germany and Japan as evidence of the benefits of capitalism. Following World War II, the availability of millions of cheap window unit air conditioners enabled places like scorching Phoenix, Arizona to attract business and people. Retirees and winter-weary migrants moved in record numbers from the North and Midwest to the Sun Belt. Migrant workers moving north from Latin America through the U.S. ensured a supply of cheap labor. Libertarian-leaning Western state governments allowed lax environmental standards, limited regulation, and low taxation for entrepreneurs and companies looking to build on the industrialization of the war. Ongoing internal migrations of African Americans to the urban north played a major role in changing the demographic character of American cities and industries. Renewed migrations of Mexicans north into the American Southwest built on long-established patterns but surpassed older trends in both numbers and reach. Across the country, suburban growth fueled by these migrations and the GI Bill caused fundamental changes in American life. Finally, millions of Americans took to the road on seasonal migrations to national parks, historic sites, and vacation spots. These leisure travelers elevated tourism to one of the most important sectors of the post-war economy. The entire U.S. experienced significant demographic shifts during and after World War II, but the newly industrialized American West and South saw the greatest changes. Both regions benefited from the war mobilization that redistributed tens of millions of soldiers and support staff and billions of dollars to massive new military installations in these regions. In pre-war 1939, the U.S. maintained a standing army of only 200,000 men. By 1949, that number had increased to more than 8 million men in the Army alone, and 12 million in the combined armed forces. This increase resulted in the most significant federally organized movement of people and resources in U.S. history. The U.S. Air Force alone required the construction of 500 new airfields and support facilities to build and service over 70,000 aircraft. Military leaders favored the South and West as locations for wartime mobilization for the region's warm weather, clear skies, and wide open spaces. Air bases were built in the desert Southwest where the climate was perfect for both training and storage, but the South got the lion's share of new air bases. Plentiful cheap labor and land combined with powerful Southern politicians help explain the clustering of air bases throughout the Southeast. The demographic and economic impact in areas surrounding military bases was immediate. Sleepy small towns such as Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Killeen, Texas, saw their populations double or more in a matter of months, from 50,000 to 100,000 in Fayetteville, and 1,100 to almost 7,000 in Killeen. Cold War imperatives ensured that the continued growth of the military-industrial complex would continue unimpeded. Racial segregation ensured that white workers benefited from federal opportunities in the South, while black workers, including veterans, suffered from high rates of unemployment. White Southern politicians used their Cold War political influence to garner a large share of federal programs. At the same time, they maintained, and even expanded in some cases, the Jim Crow system to make sure that the South played by its own rules, even as military and economic developments brought the region more closely into the fold of the nation, and the globe for that matter. The military-driven industrialization of the Sun Belt dramatically expanded the political and cultural importance of these regions.
A mass migration was underway from the crowded cities to the new suburbs. At Levittown in New York, they completed 40 houses a day and filmed one going up. The first supermarkets were opening up in the 1950s, changing the way people shopped. A family could now find everything they needed and more under one roof. To Europeans, only just ending rationing, the American abundance seemed beyond their reach. And the gap was huge. The average American's income was twice as high as the British workers and 4 times as high as the Italians. They could buy a range of goods unknown in Europe.
For families who had endured almost 2 decades of hardship, the family vacation became the ultimate expression of freedom and affluence. Automakers quickly retooled factories from military to domestic production and promoted ownership and travel. Along with the single-family home, car ownership marked a family's successful rise to the middle class, and personal mobility became a symbol of American freedom during the Cold War. Manufacturers promoted auto travel with catchy ad campaigns such as "See the USA in your Chevrolet." Americans responded by purchasing cars in unprecedented numbers. Cold War patriotism inspired widespread interest in historic sites and boosted efforts to preserve America's heritage. The Gettysburg Historic Battlefield and other iconic historic sites sprouted gateway villages with miles of nearby motels, catering to a new breed of heritage tourist. Businesses recognized the seemingly unlimited economic opportunities presented by an expanding middle class obsessed with travel and recreation. Companies like Ford capitalized on the popularity of outdoor recreation with advertising campaigns showing their vehicles loaded with camping gear and parked alongside a lake or in a mountain meadow. Cigarette companies eager to keep wartime smokers buying at home shifted from advertising that depicted dapper smokers in urban settings to ads showing rugged men and outdoorsy women enjoying a smoke around the campfire. Between the end of the war and the mid-1950s, wartime boosted products and technologies moved into the general marketplace with far-reaching consequences for American culture and economy. For those who could afford it, the vacation retreat to the slopes, the woods, or the beach provided a welcome distraction from Cold War anxieties. But not all shared equally in such relief. Carefully monitored visitor statistics in the national parks showed that less than 1% of tourists were African Americans, and even in the Southwest, the numbers for Hispanics were equally low. In the 1950s, the world of recreation travel was almost exclusively white.